My name is Oisín McGann, and I'm a writer and illustrator, and I'm here today to read from Small-Minded Giants, which is a book of mine published back in 2007, but which has become rather relevant again today. I was asked to pick something to reflect the themes of dystopia and the environment. The book was published in France as Liberté Surveillée, pardon my pronunciation, and in the US as Daylight Runner. And it's set in a city that's built as a machine under a dome. It's after an environmental disaster, and the world outside has become this frozen landscape. So the machine has been set up to make it entirely self-sustaining, so that their lives can be lived under this dome and within this city, and they don't have to go outside of it. I just realized, in honor of my hosts, I'm wearing my Asterix t-shirt, but actually you're not going to be able to see it for most of the talk, but it's there in spirit. So there are three readings I'm going to do, two of them quite short. And the first one features a character called Anna Karoa, and she's a teacher, and she becomes involved in a conspiracy, or in trying to uncover a conspiracy, because there are disasters happening in the city. They're causing the machine, to break down. And everything that everybody does in this city contributes to the working of it. So when the machine starts to break down, it threatens not just their lives, but their existence. And Anna is one of the people who becomes involved in trying to uncover what's going on. Anna sat on the grass with her eyes closed, Julio's arms around her, listening to the sounds of birds. A gentle breeze ruffled her soft hair, mixing with his warm breath on her neck and the side of her face. Leaning back against his chest, she drew in a long breath, relishing the mingled scents of fresh grass, pine, and a dozen different flowers, some like tulips and chrysanthemums, poppies and sunflowers that she knew from her walks in the conservation section of the hydroponic gardens, most of which she had never smelled before. The sound of the wind in the trees brought a smile to her face, and keeping her eyes closed, she imagined herself on a wide open hillside on the edge of a forest, looking out over a balmy, sunny landscape of untamed countryside. The sunlight was warm and bright on her eyelids. Wiggling her bare toes in the grass, she turned and kissed Julio long and hard on the mouth. A soft bell chimed, and he pulled his face back, smiling at her. Time's up. Somebody else's turn now. He gave an exaggerated frown. Drat. She opened her eyes and gazed resignedly around her at the screens that made up the walls and ceiling, showing the hillside as it had once been. They were in a private simulation chamber. Hidden ventilation ducts blew the fake breeze across the room. The carefully regulated moisture and temperature levels mixed with the manufactured scents to complete the illusion. Surround sound speakers carried the sounds of the birds across the imaginary sky, along with the rustling sound of trees that had become extinct centuries before. Even the grass was synthetic, a gently sloping bank 3 meters squared. They'd had to leave their shoes at the door. Time in one of these chambers was expensive. She'd never been in one before, but Julio worked for the owners, Internal Climate, and could get concessions, and he loved treating her. His square-jawed face and stocky body belied his somewhat nerdish lifestyle, reveling in the chaos mathematics of air currents and thermal patterns. Anna had never met anyone who could make ventilation sound so romantic. That was fantastic, thank you. She hugged him as they walked over to the door. God, you can just imagine what it was like. Julio nodded. And to think you could just go and do it, he wondered wistfully. Sit on a hillside, a real one, for free. This is the second part, the second reading. And I need you to imagine that huge cranes were used to build this city, and 4 enormous cranes. And after the city was built, the cranes now used for transport, but only by the rich and powerful. Occasionally, other people do get to use them. So 2 of the main characters featured in the scene, Solomon and Cleo. It's mostly Sol's scene this time, and they're on a school tour. Their class is being taken up in one of the crane carriages as part of their tour. And this is the opening of the book. So this is where we meet them for the first time. Anna features in this as well, but it's mostly Sol's scene. The 8 teenagers waited excitedly for the chance to be dangled from the giant's arm. Solomon Wheat stood apart from his classmates, his face hidden by the hood of his black tracksuit top, his gaze lost in the lattice shapes of the gantry silhouetted against the light of the dome above them. It was to be their turn next. They could see the arm of the tower crane swinging towards them, the glass and dense ceramic carriage starting to descend. Except for a single figure, it was empty, the rest of their class having been deposited on the far side of the complex. Despite his withdrawn posture, Saul was as excited as the rest of his classmates. He'd never been up in a crane car, and this was a luxury model, normally only used by the big noise industrialists and planners. As a school tour, this was going to be hard to top. The carriage was being lowered towards its cradle, large enough for 10 people to sit around its richly upholstered seats. Its smooth, classic, graphite-coloured curves spoke of sheer class. This was how the other half travelled, archaic but majestic. The figure inside was Vincent Schaefer, the main man, the head of the third quadrant, responsible for the very air they breathed. The carriage's cradle, a steel-framed platform, rose to meet the carriage on hydraulic arms as it was lowered the last few metres, magnets activating to pull the swinging load into line and control its touchdown with impressive accuracy. The 5 girls and 3 boys surged forward, each of them eager to be first on board and grab the best seats. "Hold on," Miss Kuroa, their teacher, called them back. "Wait until Mr. Schaefer says it's all right. That includes you, Faisal Toomey." Anna Kuroa was young and pretty in a strict teacher kind of way. Despite recently graduating from teacher training college, her voice already had that tone of authority, and the students reacted, stumbling to a reluctant halt. They waited, slowly edging closer to the door while trying to look as stationary as possible. Saul hung back near the teacher. He would try and sit near her if he could, but not so close as to be obvious. Schaefer opened the door and waved them aboard, stepping aside to avoid being knocked over in the rush. Miss Kuroa smiled an apology, shrugging helplessly as the students poured up the platform steps and through the door. Saul shifted the strap of his bag onto his shoulder, stuck his hands deeper into his pockets, and nodded to Schaefer as he passed them. There were 3 seats left together, and he took the middle one, relishing the knowledge that Miss Kuroa would have to sit beside him. He stuck his bag on the floor and twisted to look out the window behind him. They were surrounded by the ventilation complex, which made up the centre of the third quadrant. Most of the kids hated the place. They thought it ugly and cold. But to Saul it was interesting, an insight into how the city worked. A stacked maze of metal shafts, ducts, filtration systems, tall dispersal fans, and many other unidentifiable constructions served to feed air into the city from the frozen world outside. "Welcome to Schaefer Corporation. Unfortunately, at this early stage, I'm going to have to leave you," Schaefer addressed the class, interrupting Saul's thoughts. "I have a few things to attend to, but I'll meet you on the other side. I'm sure Miss Kuroa can talk you through the trip. Just a few safety messages. Sorry, I have to. You know what these safety people are like." He was a short man in a slightly rumpled suit with a pot belly, long white sideburns, and a chubby face. He didn't look like a big-shot businessman, Saul thought, and he was obviously ill at ease around young people. Knowing the young people around him, Saul couldn't blame him. "There's a safety lock on the door that operates while the carriage is in motion, but don't touch the door anyway. Keep your weight distributed evenly for a steady ride. Don't all crowd over one side of the carriage. It won't lean, but it could increase the amount of swing. If you feel sick, there are bags provided under the seats. Please use them. Oh, and no drinking or eating in the carriage." His face expressed boredom at the tiresome rules. "Right, that's my duty done. Enjoy the ride, and I'll see you on the other side." Some of the students started talking softly under their breath as Schaefer finished. Saul didn't join in. It was funny how people lowered their voices when they were excited. Miss Kuroa sat down beside him and he pulled his hood further up over his face, feeling suddenly tense. Schaefer stepped out of the carriage and closed the door firmly behind him. Saul turned to watch him. The man waved at them as if they were children and then turned to walk towards another carriage on the far side of the yard. Saul turned back as the seat shuddered underneath him and he pressed his feet against the floor in reflex. "God, this is such a rush," Cleo, one of the girls across from them, muttered to a friend. "Feel my arm, I'm all goosebumps." She was an odd-looking girl, cute enough with her Chinese eyes and blonde hair. Cleo and Saul had been friends when they were younger, but now she was just another loudmouth teenage ditz. Saul looked away. He had no taste for girls his own age. They all seemed too immature. The carriage jerked slightly, creaked, and then he felt his stomach lurch as they were lifted from the ground. There were a few whoops and squeals, and suddenly everybody was standing up and looking out the windows. "Sit down, please," Miss Kuroa called, but it was half-hearted, and she stood up herself to make the most of the view. Saul positioned himself beside her. He was taller than her, and with her head by his nose, he could smell her hair. He breathed in the scent and then moved away slightly, suddenly embarrassed by how close she was. The city fell away around them, and they rose high above the quadrant, above the ventilation complex below, above the surrounding buildings, until they could see clear across the city. Above them, the tower crane's jib turned, swinging them out and round, heading towards the second quadrant where they would connect with the gantry crane and be carried over into the food production complex. Between the tops of the 4 looming tower cranes, one in the centre of each quadrant, and the domed roof of the city, there was only the gantry grid. Each with 4 arms, the tower crane's resemblance to a force of protective metal giants was now a permanent part of their image. "We must be over 100 metres up," Cleo said, a tremor in her voice. "This must be like flying." The city of Ash Harbour looked spectacular. Built inside a hollowed-out mountain 5 kilometres across, its top roofed with a massive dome to keep out the ferocious elements, this was their whole world. Beyond those walls, deadly storms and freezing temperatures had stripped the planet bare. Saul gazed out at the city and realised for the first time just how small their world was. His window was facing towards the body of the crane, and his eyes followed it down to the bottom, a long, long way below. The crane's perspective heightened the feeling of being hung out in the sky, and he experienced a moment of dizziness. He caught sight of the carriage that Schaefer had boarded. It was hanging from another arm of the crane. It was going to pass inside the school's carriage, overtaking it as the students took the educational route. It was moving jerkily, as if something was wrong. Saul leaned harder against the glass. He could see 2 figures inside. One was on the near side of the carriage, looking anxiously towards the ceiling. He was a young man dressed in a suit of a businessman or industrialist. Saul couldn't see the other person very well, but knew it must be Schaefer. Miss Caroa saw what he was looking at and leaned in closer beside him, her shoulder touching his. "Why is it shaking like that?" she wondered aloud. "Maybe just worn bearings," he replied, wanting to sound knowledgeable. His gaze was locked on the scene before him. "They should lower it down. It doesn't look safe." The obvious alarm in her voice carried around the carriage. All of a sudden the entire class were pushing in around them, staring out at the shuddering crane car which was coming ever closer. "Maybe it's going to fall," Faisal Toomey said from behind Saul. "Shut up, you grit," Cleo snapped. "Quiet, all of you," Miss Caroa said calmly. Saul felt queasy. Seeing the unstable carriage dangling so high above the ground made him all the more conscious of their own situation. His eyes locked on the face of the man who was less than 50 metres away. This was a man who presumably travelled in these carriages all the time. Saul could see the whites of his eyes shining in fear. He could see the barely suppressed panic. Something was badly wrong. Above and beyond the other crane car, beneath the arm that held it, he could see the cabin where the controller sat. He must see that there was a problem. The carriage was only 20 metres away, but it had stopped swinging past them now, and glancing up at the trolley beneath the arm, Saul could see that the winch had started up. It was beginning to lower the car. There was a jerk in the double cables, and the carriage dropped slightly, shaking back and forth. Saul looked back up at the arm. "Jesus," Cleo gasped. The trolley's come off." The trolley holding the winch was hanging off at one end. As they watched, another of its wheels gave way, and now the entire weight of the crane car was suspended from only one corner of the trolley's welded steel frame. The rail holding the wheel was already buckling. One of the girls started crying. Somebody else joined in. "Get a grip, for God's sake," Cleo exclaimed. With everyone on one side of their car, it was unbalanced and swinging ever so slightly. Anna had her hand over her mouth. She was holding her breath. Saul spared her a glance, but quickly brought his eyes back to the man in the other carriage. The young man was clutching a rail beside the window, holding onto it for all he was worth, as if that would help hold up the dangling carriage. Saul felt the floor under his feet tremble, and he looked down in alarm. But it was a normal movement. Their carriage was starting to creep in along its jib to reach the other car. "What the hell's going on?" Faisal growled. "What's he doing?" "We're going to get them out of there," Cleo told him, "but we're going too slowly." "Vibrations," Saul hissed through tense jaws. "He doesn't want to knock the other car loose." The man could see them approaching. He looked out at them and shouted something. Letting go of the rail, he pressed both hands against the window. Growing more frantic, he started hammering his fists against the glass. On the other side, Schaefer was still looking towards the 2 control cabs. The dangling carriage jerked again, the trolley's rail pulling bolts free from the crane's arm. The young man behind the glass was talking again, pleading, urging them on. They were very close now. Saul thought he could have jumped the gap if he could have taken a run at it. They were almost within reach. Saul looked up at the trolley and saw it give, feeling it part from the arm with a jolt like a physical blow. The carriage dropped away, almost seeming to suck them after it in its wake. He saw the young man for an instant before the carriage turned into a tumble, saw him open his mouth in a silent scream behind the glass as he fell. The moment was perfectly still. And then the cable, snaking past them, smacked the broken trolley against the side of their carriage, and everyone screamed. Their carriage swung from side to side, and the other car was suddenly forgotten. They all clutched the rails on the walls over the seats. Those who missed were thrown onto the floor. Saul had a firm hold on a rail, his eyes shut tight. Anna had seized his arm and was squeezing so hard it hurt, her fingernails digging into his flesh. The swinging subsided, but it was difficult to tell. His head was all over the place, and his stomach was trying to climb out of his mouth. He smelled the sharp, rank scent of urine and knew some of his classmates had wetted themselves. Everybody was gasping and sobbing. "Get us down!" Amanda Yan shrieked. "Get us down from here! I want to get down!" They were dropping towards the ground, slowly. Anna let go of his arm, struggling to regain her composure. No amount of teacher training could prepare you for this. Around the carriage, everyone was sitting down, some trembling and crying, some silent, scared and embarrassed. Saul was surprised to find himself shivering, his heart pounding, fit to burst. Steeling himself, he looked out of the window. His stomach had a hard time dealing with the height, but it was the sight of the other carriage that finally did it. The car lay crumpled and shattered about 20 meters from where they were going to come down. He could see the bodies of the two men. Reaching under his seat, he barely got the sick bag out in time. So this is the third reading, and Saul's just come back to his apartment. Now his father has gone missing. He doesn't, at this point, he's not too bothered because his dad does kind of do all-nighters sometimes and stays out a lot, but he has now been missing for a couple of nights, and Saul is starting to wonder if something goes wrong, and it is one of the kind of central parts of the story, and that Saul goes looking for his father into kind of the depths of the machine of the city. So he comes home, he's been out on a run, and if you imagine they have apartments that are built, almost on top of each other, really. So he runs out across the rooftops at night as part of his training for boxing. He comes back, finds out his apartment's been broken into, and he's attacked by the burglars. So this is where the police have just shown up. "You've been broken into," the policeman confirmed. "Sure as shooting." "I know," Saul acknowledged sourly. He had an ice pack in each hand, one held to his nose, the other pressed against the back of his neck. His voice sounded as if he had a cold, and every time he moved his head, a furry headache rolled around inside it. The officer, who'd introduced himself as Carling, had made a cursory examination of the door, the window, and the overturned room before delivering his verdict. He did all the talking in an official, monotonous manner as his partner gazed out of the window. "Anything missing?" he asked, his tablet in his hand. "Not that I can see." Saul looked around. "I think I scared them off." "Look, aren't there tests you're supposed to do? Fingerprints and stuff?" "Nah, they'll have been wearing gloves." Carling shook his head. "We get called out to break-ins like this every day. Nothing to look for." Saul scowled. "Thanks for dropping by anyway." "Not sure I like your tone, son." "Sorry, officer, I'm 16. It's the only tone I've got." Carling chuckled dryly. "Wife and I used to live in a place like this. Had a window just like that one." He mused. "Got broke into 5 times. 5 times! And me, an officer of the law. We moved out, got an internal flat, no windows. Haven't been broken into since. Place isn't as nice, no natural light or nothing, but it's safer, you know what I mean?" Saul stared at him over the ice pack. "So what you're saying is, if we moved to a worse flat, if we didn't have any windows at all, it'd be harder to break into." "You've got to have security, son," Carling told him. "By that reckoning then, if we didn't have any doors into the flat either, we'd be completely safe." "Oh, that's being a bit extreme, son." "We had to wait 4 years to move to a place with a window. We kind of like it." Saul took the pack away from the back of his neck and looked at it. There was a little bit of blood on the cloth. "That bent out of shape?" Carling nodded towards Saul's broken nose. "I think it's just the cartilage," Saul muttered. "I'll have my coach look at it tomorrow. He sees these a lot." "You should think about personal protection then. The wife and I have a selection of personal protection measures, aside from our regulation weapons. She favours pepper spray, not that I can officially recommend it, you understand, but it's not illegal, you know what I mean?" Saul was going to point out that he was a pretty handy boxer, but then remembered that he'd been floored without getting in a single blow. So much for all his training. He stayed quiet. "Other things I can't recommend," Carling continued, "would include knuckle dusters, koshes, small, easily concealed knives, a bag of ball bearings, or even that timeless classic, the rock in the sock. I must urge you not to resort to any of these measures, but if you have to, there's a good range to be had at reasonable prices down on Buccaneer Street. Don't go there after dark." "I'll be fine as I am, thanks," Saul reassured him. His father had firm ideas about weapons. Like most boys his age, Saul had gone through a stage of playing with knives. Gregor had taken one of the blades and cut up his favourite Muhammad Ali poster with it. Saul didn't want to think about what he'd do with pepper spray or a rock in a sock. "I think we're done here, Jim," Carling said to his partner. Then looking one last time at Saul, "Stay safe, son. There are some real nut jobs out there." "Yes, sir." So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed those readings. Thank you very much for coming and watching the video. Thanks to Alliance Française Dublin for hosting it. And I wish you all a good day. And let's hope we all get through these strange times. Thanks very much.